So this is our second event this semester. I'm Mohammed Lamallam. I'm a third-year PhD student at Georgetown, doing Quranic studies, Islamic studies, history of Christian-Muslim relations. And I'm also serving as the president of Georgetown Graduate Association for Islamic Studies. We're very fortunate to have with us today an expert on Islamic education and Quranic education in Europe, as well as in the US. It's a very interesting topic in its own right, but particularly maybe in some places in Europe. It's also maybe a national issue that is of interest to them. Professor Jenny Berglund, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, is a professor of religious education in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences Education at Stockholm University in Sweden. She started her work in this area with a dissertation in 2009 titled Teaching Islam, Islamic Religious Education at Muslim Schools in Sweden. In the intervening years, she published extensively on religious education, Islamic education, as well as Islam in Europe more broadly. I invite all of you to check her works. Some of them are available on her website, the university. You can see them there. There are a lot of them, so I can mention all the titles here in this brief introduction. She's also the General Secretary of the European Association for the Study of Religions. I believe she is still holding that position, I think. So today, Professor Berglund will be talking to us about her latest research on the relationship between Quranic and public education, focusing on cases from London and Stockholm. So we'll have the talk for 40 to 50 minutes, depending on how he would like us to stay. And then we'll have a Q&A session for 20-25 minutes. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Professor Berglund.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation, and really great to be able to present some of my work also to you in this way. And of course, we are now pretty used to Zoom, all of us, so it's a new situation, and it's actually one of the benefits is that we've become more used to this type of lectures, I think, and I guess this is what we will continue, hopefully also when the situation is different. I will start by sharing my screen. So let's see that this works. Okay, can you see my screen now? Okay, that's fine.
Yes, good.
Okay, good. So it's working. Okay, so what I will share with you, as Mohammed said, I'm very grateful for the introduction, is my latest study on this topic. Anyhow, I will continue by just saying something about myself. So, well, in the introduction you heard that my focus is very much on Islamic education in Europe mainly, and Islamic education in Sweden. But also I've done studies on Islam in Sweden, and here's just a number of books. Of course, you see some of the titles are in Swedish, so that won't help you very much, but some are in English, and I will mention some of them later as well. I think that what I find fascinating with religious education within the study of religions, I come from a study of religions background with history of religions, but have focused on Islamic religious education and Islamic education. And I think that my fascination for this is also that, I mean, if you think about a religious tradition, if a religious tradition is not transmitted, taught to the younger generation, a religious tradition will stop. So I mean that there is something extremely important in the teaching of a religious tradition to the next generation. And what I found has also been that in a minority situation, as Islam is in Sweden not all, but most of the European context, it's a minority situation, then also this teaching becomes very important, because the majority society doesn't carry the tradition. So for me, this has been also interesting to see, what is it actually that you teach among everything that you can teach to the younger generation when you provide Islamic education. And this is what I looked at in my dissertation many years ago, and this is what I've been continuing to look at in different contexts, or both in Sweden and in Europe, because I think that this also says something about how Islam is formulated in European societies today. I also want to mention that something that differs Europe from the US context is that many countries in Europe, they do provide state-funded religious education in school. But this is a school subject parallel to history, maths, physical education, and so on. But it looks pretty different in different countries. And just to give a couple of examples, I mean, in Sweden, which is the country where I'm based, Sweden is known, you might know, as one of the most secularized countries in the world. We do have a school subject called religious education, but it's a non-confessional religious education. It's an obligatory school subject where you are taught about different religions from grade 1 to through high school, all through the school system. The UK has a similar system. In Germany, for example, you have a system where you get confessional religious education when you go to state school. This means that if you are Catholic, you get Catholic religious education. If you're Protestant, you get Protestant religious education. If you're Muslim, you get Islamic education, etc. Finland has a similar system. France is more like the US, that in state schools, you don't have a religious education school subject, but you can be taught about different religions within the history subject or something. So this is to say something about the school system, because I think that this also affects the way that Islam is taught both inside and outside schools. But that's something that differs. I wrote this publication that you see to the left for the Brookings Institution, which was about this publicly funded Islamic education in Europe and the United States. And United States is the smaller part of the publication, I should say. So where this is part of state education, or state paid education. In the Swedish system, we have Muslim schools. They are state funded, but they are privately run. There's a similar situation in the UK, where some are state funded and some are privately funded. But this provides, there are different rulings around different laws around these different schooling. But that's more to say something about the context where this study is done. Because the case is that in this study, my most recent study, I was interesting to see, because in my previous study, I've met a lot of students who didn't, where I studied the publicly funded Islamic education within the state school system. There was also a number of students who also took Islamic education outside, as many do, the kind of mainstream school. And I became interested in how the supplementary Islamic education that they took related to the mainstream schooling. And I was looking into previous research, and there is quite a lot on studies of supplementary education, especially in the UK. There is probably also some in about some other European countries, but this is also a linguistic problem. I don't read French very well, or German, so it's mostly the English-speaking literature that I've been able to look into. But no one had really asked the students who actually move between these two types of schooling what their experience was. So this is what I became interested in to look at. And why then Well, the UK and Sweden has similarities and differences. I mean, it is two countries with a fairly high percentage of Muslim population. In Europe, Sweden is a small country with only around 10 million inhabitants, but out of those, 500,000 to 600,000 are Muslims, which is an estimation, of course. The UK, with a very different history and the colonial history, around 64 million with 2.7 million Muslims. It's also that both countries are affected by, of course, European laws, European Convention on Human Rights, where it states very clearly that the right of parents to ensure that education and teaching conform with their own religious and philosophical convictions. So it's the right to provide your own children with and teenagers with education. And this can be done within the school system or, of course, outside the school system. Both of these countries also have this school subject in school, religious education, which was also something I was interested in. If you get one type of religious education in school, how do you relate that to the type of Islamic education or Quran education that you get outside school? What's the experience of this? And this is just an image to also an image of the relation that I wanted to study. I should also mention, I should have done that in the beginning, that the part that I've done in London, I've also worked together with a colleague, Dr. Bill Gent, affiliated to Warwick University, who had a lot of contacts with schools and Islamic education that helped me to get students to interview and so on. Bill very sadly passed away in April. He got sick in COVID-19. So this, of course, affected what we were doing and so on. So that was very sad indeed. Anyhow, when I talk about supplementary Islamic education, what do I mean? It's basically afternoon or weekend activities that students take part of after the mainstream schooling. And these are run by mosques, Muslim organization, sometimes families, could be a bit different in different settings. And when so part of it was also to see the similarities and differences between these different types of supplementary Islamic education. But one core thing, how we made our choice, because I mean they could look quite different, is that we were interested to see that the learning of the Quran was part of this Islamic education. But apart from learning how to read and recite the Quran, there are, of course, as you know, different parts, and it could these are kind of the main parts of this education, if you kind of want to generalize what was part of it. But in some settings, the 90% of the time was spent on reading, reciting the Quran. In some parts, it was maybe 20%, depending on what mosque organization or Muslim organization that provided this type of education. Anyhow, something that was, as I said, was of course the memorization of the Quran and tajweed as part of this. And of course, memorization of the Quran is often considered the backbone of Islamic education, and also this emphasis on orality in the transmission of knowledge. And this was also became very interesting, I think, when we discussed with the students what part of education that they actually brought over to or brought with them to the mainstream education, but also the other way around, because we were kind of interesting to see how both these settings, how the students themselves expressed that they experienced both these settings. something that then, looking at this in two different contexts, something that became fairly obvious is also how the mainstream society affects what is done also in the supplementary Islamic education. In the UK settings, to the left, for example, we have photos from British mosques in London and their Islamic education. I mean, and in the middle, you see some of the Swedish settings. Something that became quite interesting was that in the UK settings, all the different supplementary education places that we visited, both for younger children and for teenagers and so on, were gender segregated, which they were not in the Swedish settings. They were sometimes gender segregated, but sometimes not. There was a difference. I think this has also to do with the what type of Islam, what type of organizations that provide these. In quite a few Swedish settings, the teacher told me that of course we would prefer to have gender segregated Islamic education, but we don't have a teacher, and in Sweden boys and girls go to the same school. There is no tradition of gender segregation in school, so we don't see it as that necessary to have it here. So there were different discussions on it, but the fact remains that there was a difference in this. Something that also became apparent that we also met, even if our intention in the beginning was to go have these different Islamic organizations that provided it, it also became obvious in school that so many youngsters also took online tuition, which of course has boosted in the same way as online teaching in these times have boosted for universities and schools and so on. So that, and this was a couple of pre-corona years, but of course getting quite a few, I mean, the UK setting is dominated by Muslims from the Southeast Asia with Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Indian context. And of course, it's could sometimes be very easy to get online tuition from someone in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and so on, instead of providing someone in London. And today that is an option for many families to kind of organize that type of. So the transnational teaching was quite obvious here as well. And that was actually something that we hadn't really considered. But if we just look at these from kind of the differences that we could see between England and Sweden then. Also in the British context, it was, or the London context, I should say, because it's London and Stockholm, even if I've written Sweden and England here. There was a dominance of students going every day after school to supplementary Islamic education. So after school, they would go home and then away to the mosque or to the organization or to the online tuition. Whereas in Sweden, I didn't come across a single person who went every day to Islamic education in the afternoon. It was mostly once a week or twice a week. This has, of course, can be traced back to the dominance of different Muslim groups, and Sweden, I should say, it's not as in the British context where it's kind of dominated by Muslims from Southeast Asia, but in Sweden it's a very, very mixed Muslim population from nearly each and every part of the world. So you would have Turks, Palestinians, Somali, also from Pakistan, just going on. So very, very diverse, heterogeneous Muslim population with no domination of a single group. And kind of not in terms of Islamic education, it's a lot of it's not so big groups, I would say. Each and every mosque would have its Islamic education, but not necessarily connected to another one. And as I mentioned before, sometimes in the Swedish context, it was gender mixed, whereas it was often or always gender segregated in the London context that we found. But of course, a lot of other activities connected to this. It also became quite apparent that apart from these central parts of Quran studies and the kind of religious core of the activities, there was quite a lot of other activities connected to what we could call supplementary Islamic education. And these are just some things that we found, that, you know, even if you say, even if the students would say that this is Quran education, Islamic supplementary education, there's so much else apart from the kind of core religion education, like artistic performance, cycling clubs, that was in the London context, and theater and other things like that. I should mention that that's more of an anecdote, that in one of the Swedish Shia Muslim mosque in Stockholm, who have provide weekend supplementary Islamic education, the students will get like 1 or 2 hours of Islamic education, but they also get 1 or 2 hours of maths. And I was a bit surprised because I didn't really understand how come that they get both these very, you know, religiously connected, and why maths. And then when I talked to the parents who were there, it was obvious that this mosque was dominated by Iranians who thought that Swedish maths education was not what they expected. They didn't think it was as good as in Iran. So they had discussed with the leadership at the mosque and said that, you know, we just have to do something about it. So let's give them 1 or 2 hours of extra maths here, so that we get so that they live up to the maths education that is provided in Iran. But yeah, so that was kind of anecdotally, that's also to see that supplementary Islamic education can be more than yeah, what I expected. Perhaps someone else would not be so surprised as I was. Maybe it says more about me, actually. Anyhow, so this kind of, there is a discussion and a tension between this secular education and Islamic education. There's quite a bit of literature that also says that this is this tension can be problematic and so on. But we wanted also to see how the learners themselves, the students themselves, make sense of attending two traditions of education and learning. So we thought that was the kind of interesting question. And here I just wanted to I'll provide you with a couple of quotes, because I thought which would lead into the results later. Here is some students saying, well, I'll read it for you. I used to read the Quran in front of my teacher and the students at mosque when I was little, sometimes at celebrations as well. Presentations at school are similar. You learn what you want to say at home and then add a poster or PowerPoint to that. My mom used to take me on Saturdays, but I wasn't very happy about it. I missed important football matches with my team. My mom liked to go because she met her friends. I lead you into what, you know, these would be part of later. Last year, when we had German speaking assessments, we had to memorize quite a lot in a different language, but obviously we knew what it meant. So I managed to get A stars, which is the highest possible grade then in most of these. Rob from London. These are, of course, names that we put on them. Maths, for example, simultaneous equations. When you memorize something, it's stays in your head, it's the same with math as with Quran. You need to memorize certain things. So what was obvious when we started to interview these teenagers was that most of them, well, the first thing that was obvious was that actually no one had asked them before about the relation between the supplementary education and school education. So people would talk to them about their supplementary education within the Muslim settings, and then people would talk about the mainstream schooling and so on. But they had never ever been asked if there was a relation between it and how they made up for that, which was interesting as such. So I think that the fact that just talking about it, made them start thinking. And then it took a while, but after a while, these were the type of quotes that came up, that, okay, if I can, for example, memorize here, I can memorize there. If I can learn this, that, I can learn. I mean, these are two learning settings that they need to make sense of. Which is, of course, not unique for Islamic supplementary education. A lot of supplementary education goes on in society. Then there was, of course, experiences like this. When I told her, the teacher, I attended Quran education in the weekend, the teacher said, "You shouldn't do that. From then on, I have not talked about it in school." Another quote, "Every morning through the summer holiday, a teacher came to our home and taught me and my little brother to recite and memorize the Quran. In school, I said I took a summer course in Arabic." So we also found that and this was actually more for Sweden than for London, that we had students who said that, yes, they had attended Quran education or mosque education for many, many years, but they didn't mention it in school, in mainstream school, because when they had mentioned it, they had got very negative reactions from teachers or fellow students and so on. And of course, when we discussed this with students, it very much had to do with ideas about what is Quran education actually, and Quran education attached to negative things and also to extremist situation and so on. And actually, we did focus media attention and looked into how the media presents supplementary Islamic education in the Swedish setting, and it's mostly when you find the word Quran education, it's connected to something very negative if you look at the only Swedish news media. Well, the interpretation is that the teachers in this case are affected of this and then react in this way to for the students. And this is just to mention, I published an article on this, especially in relation to my Swedish material, Secular Normativity and the Reification of Muslims in Swedish Public Schooling, where I look more deeply into this situation in the Swedish setting. Anyhow, when we looked at these different, we tried to list then examples what is gained in Islamic education that helps in school, and also on this other side, examples of what is gained in school education that helps in Islamic education. And just trying to make sense of what came up in the different interviews and settings like this. And which also I tried to sort out this and categorizing in knowledge, skills, and attitudes. And of course, when you get knowledge about history, Islamic history, history of Islam, that would also then students would say that could help them in school education. And this is then, I should say, based also on that both the London and Swedish Stockholm schools have religious education as a school subject. So I mean, if you learn something in the mosque about Islamic history that would help you in the school setting. Although the fact that in the mosque setting, it's of course inside perspective, that type of education, and which is different from the one, you still get knowledge that could help you. What most of the students focused was the skills, which was interesting, that memorization, evaluation, confidence, concentration, etc. was something that they learned in Islamic education that could also help them in the mainstream school setting. They also talked about self-control, tolerance, patience. And when we look at the other side, example, what is gained in school that could help in Islamic education, life skills, English reading, reading came up in among the English-speaking ones, experiences from the future, socializing, respect, equality, tolerance. But there was, of course, also things, I mean, these are on both sides, because the question here, what helps you in, what do you get in, what is gained in Islamic education that helps you in school? That's, of course, a positive question. And on the other side, what helps in the other way around? We, in the interviews, we also had negatives coming out. For both the schooling and the Islamic education. For schooling, the negatives were then examination, stress, homework. I mean, these are quite well-known things that students would provide of Islamic education or mainstream education. And for the positives and negatives of Islamic education, the negatives would then, the fact that they had to rush to class after school, that was especially among the British students who actually went every day 2 hours. But interestingly, also the Swedish students complained and said that, oh, it's 2 hours every Saturday or Sunday, that takes time. So kind of, it was something, it was not dependent actually on how much time they spent on Islamic education. It was more on the fact that they did spend time on it, that it could become repetitious, and also that teachers would be bossy and instill fear in some of the Islamic education settings. Well, that would have been interesting to look into some of these aspects more. But one of the questions that I had for all these students that I interviewed was that I also asked them, if when in the future you get children of your own, will you put them into Islamic education? Because I think that turning it to that would say also something else. And that was, I think, you know, nearly everyone say that they would, but some said that, yes, I would, but not 5 days a week. Or yes, I would, but I would make sure that the teacher is young. Or yes, I would, but I would make sure that, so they would qualify. There was a yes, but often with a qualification. Even though some said, only said yes. So there was a positive response to that, seeing that this is, of course, the way that the religion is transmitted to next generation, as I said in the beginning. But anyhow, then I think that what was interesting in this also, when I wanted to internalize the interviews of the students about their dual educational experience, as I said, it is very much of the skills that they focus. And even when I tried to turn into more spiritual questions, they kind of made this divide as soon as secular school was brought up. It was one thing if we only talked about the Islamic education, but as soon as I brought in, you know, what is brought from one side to the other, there was a very big focus on skills. And I think that this can be understood as a form of strategy, which in the Bourdieu, in Pierre Bourdieu sense, differs a bit from how we use strategy in everyday language, for example, in chess. Strategies are how individuals, groups, or institutions try to protect the value of their capital, for example, defending or improving their positions. And I mean, such attempts are often more or less unconscious. And in Bourdieu's sense, when you use strategies in another way than everyday language or in the economic vocabulary, it's more of a deliberate thing. Here it's also not always deliberate. So to make sense of the Quran education in a secular context, the students focus on the skills. Because this would be how do I make sense of this? It's a way of bringing religious and secular languages closer to each other, you can say. One question one can ask is, how much does this depend on me, also as me being a non-Muslim asking this question, maybe seeing me as a representative of the secular school, even when I come from the university, since they are connected. So in many sense, you can then say that the students' Quran education could also be viewed as a hidden capital, because it's not viewed as a capital in the secular school sense, but it is, of course, in the Muslim settings. I mean, it's a very it's definitely a cultural capital in that sense, but of course, it's not as easily brought over to secular school if you don't. But if you put it if you speak about it in terms of skills, it became something that is of value also there. But to complement this discussion, I also wanted to bring in the concept of liturgical literacy, which actually refers to the practice of using religious texts in liturgy, where the understanding of the content is not in focus, but the ability to memorize and use it, since much of the memorization of the Quran is done without focusing the meaning of the words, since the basic idea is that you first memorize the Quran, and then when you get older, you learn to understand the meaning. And this Rosowsky, who writes about liturgical literacy, points to this and say that this is a kind of a literacy that is often forgotten, that it's a type of literacy that exists within many religious traditions, but it's something that secular school doesn't acknowledge as a type of literacy, since literacy in secular school sense is that you should understand each meaning directly of each word. And liturgical literacy has often been ostracized in relation to mainstream schooling. Memorizing the Quran is thus not a kind of learning that is limited to the mere intellectual involvement with the text. It's not only kind of the cognitive aspect of it, but because it's also a type of embodied learning. And of course, spiritually, you can understand this as it involves incorporating the words of the Quran as the speech of God into the pupils, being and making it part of their kind of physical repertoires, at least ideally. But I think this is kind of one part of it, and the spiritual part of it that you can understand. But then putting liturgical literacy also brings also liturgical literacy also forwards these skills, since using, memorizing, performance exactly. It's something that a skill that you learn, and I think that this has been something that also when I've been back to some of these contexts and discussed also kind of this more memorizing aspects, that has been interesting for the teachers to go back to. And I should say here, which I should perhaps have mentioned in the beginning also, that at least if you look at the Swedish context, memorizing is not something that is focused. I mean, it's rather so that teachers would say that you don't need to memorize. I mean, we have a Google society. You don't need to memorize, you Google everything. But here it's very obvious, yes, you do need to memorize. And honestly, when we learn some stuff that is learned in secular school needs to be memorized, like maths. Maths was brought forward, languages was brought forward, and also before some of the tests. So I think that's some of the things that we really thought would be interesting to look into further. And I should say also that some of the findings, we also, I also gathered a number of scholars on who were doing work on Islamic education in the European context. So we had like a conference when we discussed the relation between public schooling and Islamic education. And the chapters are brought together, or the different presentations are brought together in this book this called European Perspectives on Islamic Education and Public Schooling. And to point to one of the publications I made on more focusing this liturgical literacy as a hidden capital, I just wanted to point to this article, which is open access also, which focuses on the experiences specifically on the Swedish students. And it's actually this Journal of Applied Language Studies actually has a full, they have several articles, a special issue on focusing on Quran education, but from different perspectives, which I thought was quite interesting that a Journal of Applied Sciences did such a thing. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. That's wonderful. Maybe we can now quit share screen.
Yeah, I could.
So yeah, we can see the other. Yeah, that's good. That raises a lot of questions. One of the questions that I would ask is, so now your work is analytical and descriptive, but if you would give recommendations based on what you see going on in both sectors, what recommendations you would give either to the secular or to the Islamic education sector to maybe enhance, to cooperate, to benefit from each other?
Yeah, I think there are quite a few things that we could recommend. I mean, if you go to secular school, for example, I think it's quite problematic that we have teachers who would then answer students who say that they go to Quran education in a way that you shouldn't do that, or that's don't do that. I mean, obviously that would not help the learning of the students. I mean, that's pretty basic and simple. I think instead acknowledging that, okay, interesting, you are going to Quran education, you know, having a discussion on what is that, what you learn from that, how you know, that would help the learning. That would be more focused on the students' learning. Of course, we all know that there exists really supplementary religious education, Islamic education, or Quran education that are not good for the students or so on. I mean, all religious traditions have been used to force people, but I mean, to have that as your kind of basic is instead of being curious and how does that, because obviously the students that we interviewed in this project, they had quite a lot to say that helped them. I think that's an interesting, and I also think that would provide more help for the learner. In the other way around, I think it was also interesting for those who teach Islamic education, supplementary education, to ask themselves, okay, what do these students actually learn in school that could help them in their Islamic education? And discuss with the students, okay, what did you learn in school about history or about Islam or something? Some of the students that we interviewed, I didn't, you know, I can't bring everything into a presentation, but they said that something that they appreciated in secular school was that they learned about different Islamic traditions. I mean, obviously, if you go to mosque education, you learn about your own. I mean, that's kind of the role of a mosque education. But they said that it's interesting to get the perspectives of different Islamic traditions in mainstream schools, and that's of course could be of interest for the teachers of Islamic education. I've actually, which could be interesting, I'm now in contact with a school in Sweden who provide teaching of Swedish for grown-up immigrants, and they contacted me because they had read some of my publications, and they are now in contact with some Quran teachers because they have seen that, okay, we have students who are very, very skilled in memorization. Maybe this can actually help them also when learning Swedish language. Which is an interesting idea. I'm not a language scholar, so I can't say that this helps, but I think it's interesting that they are looking into it, that they are learning in different ways this, because they've had some students who have big problems learning Swedish, so they're trying to change the strategy. And of course, I haven't done any research on that, but I just thought that they kind of that was the consequence of reading some of my work, which is interesting for me to see how that pedagogically were down. And then, of course, the fact that so many supplementary Islamic education settings provide something, as I said, it's not, it's Quran, Hadith, they learn about, the narratives, the Islamic history is also, but there's quite a lot of other stuff going on in these settings as well, depending, of course, who is organizing. Something that was very obvious to me in the London setting is also the class differences. I mean, sometimes when I went to a mosque, I would start by looking at the parking lot. Okay, what are the cars in this parking lot? Are the scruffy cars, or is it BMW and Audi and so something? And by looking at the parking lot, I would know something about what would be going on in the classroom. So, and then of course, this is a context where some parents can pay a lot to get the very, very, special, updated, interactive, with a lot of materials, computers, high technology, Islamic education, and so on, or parents who cannot afford that, or maybe can afford anything, but so it's very, very different what is Islamic supplementary education, depending on who has money to pay it. Obviously, I mean, that's not rocket science, but it's interesting to see the differences that how much money is put into it.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's also interesting that all of them, I think, qualified their yeses to teaching Islamic education in the future to their children. Means that they have a lot to say about both Islamic education and secular schooling, because maybe that's the result of their experience, but also they would compare, even unconsciously, maybe compare both settings, what they gain from this, what's more interesting to them in this setting versus the other setting. So I think you're doing a very interesting work based as you are focusing on the students who are the ones who are attending both forms of education. And also, by the way, sorry for your loss for your colleague.
And Bill Gent has been doing a lot of work in the British setting on supplementary Islamic education. So he has if you Google his name, you will find quite a few publications of his looking in. I mean, we've written some things together and then also separately on this, and he's written several publications on Hifz classes specifically.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I have more questions, but I will open it up for our participants and see if they have comments, questions. Stephen, go ahead.
I also have lots of questions because this ties into my own research, but I guess
I can understand.
I guess I'll do one for now. I mean, did the students, or I don't know if you interviewed the parents too, but did they, I mean, was there any sense of conflicts that were presented? Like, did anyone notice how, like, or object to students learning things in secular education that disagreed with what they were taught in Islamic education? Or were they upset with, like, values or lifestyle choices endorsed or tolerated or accepted in the secular education that disagreed with what Islamic values were?
I mean, they didn't really bring up that because that was not really how we posed the question, because we were posing what they were taking from one setting to the others. I mean, we did, we had the different settings. And for example, this question of gender segregation, that would be that some in the Swedish context said that we thought that, you know, my parents think that we should have a gender segregated Islamic education in this school, but you know, this is not really happening. They didn't bring up, I thought actually we would find some who would kind of oppose that, the fact that we do have a non-confessional religious education, that because sometimes that is brought up that some students would prefer not to go to that, but no one actually said that of the students. But then of course I didn't ask the parents if they had that. There were students who said that something that they learned in school that they also brought to the Islamic education was to pose critical questions. And of course the reaction to that was different depending on the teacher that they had. So that could be something in that, but there was not anything exactly that they opposed in secular school, but it's the students we asked, not the parents. I think more if you, in my studies of Muslim schools in Sweden, I found much more of that, because then you had parents who chose Muslim schools in Sweden because they didn't want their students to go to secular school because they were worried about drugs and you know, sexual liberation and, you know, things like that. So they thought that the Muslim school was a much more safe environment where you could kind of keep more control of the students.
That's good. We'll go to more.
I had a quick, more practical question on the not exactly that conflict, but where are some of the frictions between the Islamic education and the secular education? I'm just saying more practically speaking. I mean, it's a lot of studying these students are undergoing, right? Between, I mean, if you're going, let's say, you know, every evening or even once a week, you spend so many hours memorizing Quran. You know, especially even at a young age, it's not exactly an easy task. And historically, people would spend their entire life doing it. So how do they kind of manage that physically? I mean, especially in the European education system, there's a great demand for, you know, IB testing, standardized testing, getting into university. So there's a lot of pressure on these students. How are they managing that overall?
Yeah, that's a good question, because sometimes I wonder as well. Because, you know, my kids wouldn't manage to go every day 2 hours to supplementary education. I mean, I was pretty impressed of science, you know, the timing they had. I also think when I talked to people I mean, this was the British students who would then go every day. I talked to some of the teachers in the secular school about this, and I kind of asked, how do they manage? And then they said, well, there is a problem because they don't do their homework properly. And some said they do, and they are very good in scheduling their work. So I mean, that would be pretty different. But this idea of leisure time, you know, some of these kids did not have any time for you know, playing or going to basketball or football or things like that. That would be in the British context, because they spend so much time on this. Then, of course, you could also say that this is also a way for parents of knowing where their teenagers are. I mean, it's pretty common for all parents that, you know, you don't want to know what your teenagers or children are doing. You don't want them on the streets. So, of course, this is a way of providing an activity where you know where they are, as is other activities.
And that got me thinking. I mean, certainly in the Western world, music education is very common. You know, students spending a lot of time doing varsity sports is very common. You know, instead of taking piano lessons for years, and even if they never become pianists, but they spend, you know, hours and hours a week. Do you see chronic education any different from those kind of extracurriculars? Is it just another extracurricular that maybe the secondary education system just needs to accept? And if there are any kind of, if there is a resistance, it's more so based on a lack of understanding versus rather an actual timing, or, you know, maybe these issues are not so much of a problem because ultimately students are busy.
Depends on the supplementary education you go to, because they were also so different. I mean, there would be those who had, as I said, theater included in the Islamic education, performance, and of course a lot of performance at religious holidays and so on. So it was like that type of education. For others, it was more a studios only memorization thing that you did in that, so they wouldn't have that much time for and of course you could say that would clash with that, because there, you know, there is a restricted amount of hours that you could spend.
And what is the government administration of this program, of these programs in general, like? I mean, there's a lot of growing literature on this kind of idea of a bureaucratized Islam, especially in Western Europe, the idea, and now it's becoming even more of a popular policy that, you know, the government should somehow intervene more so in Islamic schools, or they should regulate them more. Not, I'm saying that there's necessarily any real need, but did you see that kind of coming up in these schools in this context? Did you see the students even kind of, based not just on the kind of perceptions of teachers of their education, but also of boards of educational departments, understanding where does chronic education kind of fit in the larger sphere of public education in general in Sweden or in Britain?
No, I don't think it would fit within the general. I mean, this is supplementary, so it's not governed by, you know, educational policy or educational law in each of these countries. But of course, there is a growing interest in. There has, in the British context, also been, you know, the whole idea of madrasa schooling, and if madrasa schooling is you know, teaching extremism and so on. So there is a whole discussion around that issue. But of course, these are not state-controlled institutions. Then, of course, as part of a research project, one also has to, you know, the ones that we visit are the ones that want us to visit. That's also part of the if you're doing this kind of research. But that's for the ones that we. I mean, the students that we interviewed, they were from so many different places. Not that there was no chance that we could visit all the places that they came from. So I mean, it's both going out to these different places, but it's also the students who take part of it. And there is a growing discussion on governmental control. And so on, but that's not really, it's not, no one going, since it's not government sponsored, it's not, the government cannot control what is being said. That's a different in the Muslim schools, and in the Islamic education that takes part within the school system. But of course, because when the state provides the money, the state can also control. So I mean, it's both an opportunity to get Islamic education within the state school system, but it's also a possibility for states to control what is and that's very obvious in, I think, in the state-sponsored settings. I mean, there was hardly any discussion on Islamic education in Europe before 9/11. Then suddenly the states in Europe turn very interested and want to provide Islamic education. which has also to do with, you know, it's both an opportunity and a way to opportunity to get it within the state schools, but it's also a way of controlling it.
Thank you.
That's great. Maybe Stephen has one more question.
Oh yeah, I could always keep going. Obviously there are two different models of getting education. The model of like you go to a religious school that teaches both religious and secular subjects, or what you were studying in this most recent work of this mainstream schooling with supplementary education. So you've actually studied both models at various times, at least in Sweden. What do you see as the advantages and disadvantages of each model? And would you recommend, I mean, like, any sense of which is better?
I mean, they are quite different. I mean, when you go to a supplementary education, you get the religious education. I think, of course, as a minority in a secular majority or post-Protestant majority country, how else would you, I mean, otherwise your religious tradition will stop. So, I mean, I can understand the necessity of it. But of course, getting it in within the school system, it could more tune in with other school subjects and so on. So that's, it's so very, I can understand that. I mean, if we look at Germany, for example, where you get confessional religious education within the state school system, I can understand that that is for a minority something that you would benefit, because then you don't have to send your kids to the supplementary Islamic education outside schools. They could do other things instead, if you agree on it, of course, because that's a discussion also, if you agree on it. On the other hand, when a school provides teaching about different religions, I think that's important. I mean, also to counter different ideas about religious traditions that we find in the media and in politics and so on, that you get kind of a secular understanding of different, but you know, that also has its limitations. It's not that much that you can learn. I mean, if we look at the Swedish RE subject, where you learn about different religions in secular school, it's not much that you learn about Islam, for example, or about Christianity or any other religious tradition, because it's a very limited amount of time. But yeah, I don't know if I could recommend the one to the other. That's yeah. I'm pretty impressed by some of them, but by others, not at all. You know, sometimes when I visit different religious schools, I would have in mind, would I put my own children here? Because that's like a litmus test on you know, trying to if you take away the difference in religious traditions, you know, there are some excellent ones that are supplementary education. Super impressed of them, but others, you know, I wouldn't put my kids there any second. But you know, being who I am.
And when you studied like Muslim schools specifically, at least in your dissertation, how good were they in like teaching the secular subjects? I mean, did having like a worldview that pervaded like everything help, or like what did you see as the effect?
Well, Muslim schools in Sweden have to follow the national curricula, otherwise you don't get the government money. So they have to have also qualified teachers for this. So you know, it wouldn't be that all the teachers came from the same background, and that would be a diversity. And Islamic education could then be provided as a 1 to 3 hours a week. So definitely that they could teach secular subjects as well. That shouldn't differ, and would in many cases not differ, but can differ if they don't get qualified teachers. It's different in the UK, where you have many private not government sponsored schools, but they can also, you know, they would have other possibilities of providing more hours in Islamic school subjects than you can do otherwise. But I think there's quite a big difference between the Muslim schools. This was quite a few years ago, but also if you look at the Muslim schools that we have in Sweden, they are not very many, but they would differ quite a bit between them, both what they put into the Islamic education supplementary school subject and how they would teach about Islam generally. And also the organization of schools can be different, but you know, when it's governmentally sponsored, they need to follow that the rules of that. I got a question here from Nora, who's asked, do these Muslim schools teach about other world religions in their curriculum? In terms of the Swedish Muslim schools, they have to do that. They have to provide teachings about other religions as well, because that's part of the national curriculum. So they could have the Islamic education Islamic education school subject, but they would have to provide knowledge about different religions as well within the kind of secular RE school subject to get the government funding. Okay, I was doing this to the thank you of Nora.
So maybe you haven't touched on this in your research, but how is the Islamic schools case different from other religious communities in Sweden or in London or places where you did your research? Did you compare, or did you find something?
I mean, we could look at, if we look at the ones in the Swedish settings, I mean, Sweden does not have a long tradition of religious schools as some other European countries. I mean, in the Netherlands, there's many religious schools. There's much more in Denmark. Sweden does not really have that type of tradition. And then, of course, it differs between different Christian religious school as well, but it would be the same basic idea that they have to teach the secular school subject, and then they can provide extra hours in Bible studies or Christian religious education. So that would follow the same model, but there are much more Christian schools in Sweden than Muslim schools. There is a couple of Jewish schools as well, but that's what we have in terms of religious schools. Something that is interesting, I think, is also seeing how the school system and the country, I mean, in Sweden, there are no gender segregated schools, for example. All schools are mixed, boys and girls. And so the Muslim schools are also mixed, and the Christian schools are also mixed. Whereas in the UK, you have a tradition of gender segregation. A lot of people go to, not having to do with religion, but you have girls' schools and boys' schools. And there's also, there is a class aspect of this as well, where what is called public schools in the UK settings, you know, and of course, the Muslim schools tune into this, you know, so they would be gender segregated. In Sweden, we don't have a school uniform tradition. The UK has a school uniform tradition, so of course, the Muslim schools tune into the school uniform tradition. I mean, I once took a colleague from the UK to a Swedish Muslim schools, and you know, so, since no one has a school uniform, there would be, you know, pretty different types of way of dressing, and he was very surprised because, you know, he was used to school uniforms in all educational settings, and when you then go to the Muslim schools in the UK, girls would wear the hijab and boys would perhaps wear a topi or something like that. But, you know, you wouldn't find that. Some would in the Swedish setting, but no school uniform, people would dress decently. And then, of course, what that is would differ between schools, as it does in another way as well.
Yeah, so maybe we should, oh, maybe you have another question, or maybe we should end here.
I could ask one more thing, but there's also something in comment that someone had just said.
Yeah, there is a question from Nora about the differences between Muslim schools in the US and Sweden.
No, to be honest, I don't know that much about, you know, I haven't visited Muslim schools in the US context. But I mean, they are not state sponsored. So I guess that Stephen here would probably know, would be the one who could answer that, I guess.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't have this Swedish context to really be able to compare that either. But the question, I guess, clarifying differences within the supplementary Islamic education context, like you mentioned, like you saw differences in class. I mean, obviously the technology, I mean, the amount of technology they have would be different, but was there a difference in what was taught or how it was taught? And also, like, did you notice differences in the supplementary education by whether it was Sunni or Shia, or what sort of Sunni school of thought they followed?
Yeah, I mean, that would be a number of different of Sunni schools, you know, following. And there are quite big differences. I mean, but there are differences within the different Shia traditions, depending on where I went. And yes, and also within, you know, what type of interpretation within Sunni you also follow. So I think that it's more the generalized picture, I think, is sometimes problematic. You would have those who are more Sufi orientated. You would have more modernist interpretations, going into more classical ones. And also in terms of Shia schools, you would, I mean, for example, I went to both the ones who are kind of in Persian, teaching in Persian or Arabic, where then you would have people running it who would be Shia Iraqis or Iranians and so on. So it's also ethnically based quite. Many of the students that I interview who had a Somali background, they were very, very well, you know, they had the tradition of reciting the Quran from very early age. So they would be very young, but having you know, being Hafiz already at 10 or something like that, which you wouldn't find in some other. So I think also the ethnicity that dominates the specific mosque or school has quite a lot to say about how the Islamic education is provided.
And how did class differences affect what was taught and how it was taught in the supplementary schools?
How it was taught, it was very much technology and so on. It was also, you could see that I think that the ones that in class difference that were more costly, they would use very much the same kind of technology that they use in good schools, in good secular schools, that they would use that. For example, internet and computer games or things like that to provide history of Islam, for example. Video games and stuff like that. Whereas the poorer one would be maybe only the recitation of the Quran, the memorization and the reading.
So the more like wealthier schools would do more than just would do things besides just memorization, like the supplementary activity. Okay.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we visited one supplementary Islamic education in London who actually provided, apart from you know, narratives, hadith, tafsir, or so, they provided help to do a CV. First, I didn't understand, because the students would say, so what do you learn, what subjects in this supplementary school? So they would talk about Quran, hadith as well. And then they said, and then it's of course good that we have CV. And I was like, CV, what is that? And I didn't get it. I was trying to kind of, you know, no, to write your CV, curricula vitae. And I thought that, oh, but they saw that this is a way of becoming a good Muslim and getting a good job. Or that was how it was presented at the school. But I didn't catch it until I asked the teachers, what are you doing, CV? Yeah. Okay.
So I think we'll end it here.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor. That's been very insightful. Thanks for your time, and see you everyone next time.
Okay. Thank you very much. And thank you for listening. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you so much.